Welcome to UberCube, the podcast where we discuss all things cube, but with refreshments. This is your host, Anthony Adams, aka Uber Bear, and I'm joined by my other host,
Stu. Welcome to the show. And
And-
today we are joined by our most esteemed cube aficionado, expert, god of all
Peasant
things.
God, Pauper
Yep,
God.
Exactly.
Hey everybody, how you doing? This is Chris Moore, aka Sandwich.
How you doing today?
I'm doing all right, doing well.
Good.
So you really excited to talk about this pauper peasant stuff we're going to talk about today?
I would love that, but I don't think that's on the menu right now.
No, it's definitely not. But you know what? We're just going to have a little bit of fun here. So UberCube was blessed and honored to be a part of the Gathering recently, an Extra Life convention. And it was actually done by the Gathering Place out of Chapel Hill, North Carolina, a wonderful LGS full of just amazing human beings that I highly recommend anybody in the local area go check out. It's got a bar. It's just a really cool place. I was fortunate enough to hook up with them and talk to them about this thing that we're so passionate about, Cube. And they said, you know what? We've got an event going on. How about UberCube? How about the team just come out and join us? And so we did. Both myself, Stu, and Chris had a wonderful time hanging out. And what was it, Stu? It was a Legacy 5K Pioneer.
They had a bit of
event,
everything.
right?
Yeah, they had Modern, Legacy, Pioneer, two different Pioneers, and old school and vintage tournaments going on. So it was a huge event, hundreds and hundreds of people, all the usual fun and activities. They had artists there, all kinds of different fun events. So call it silent auctions, as well as all the vendors and stuff there. So really cool event, lots and lots of activity, lots and lots of Magic playing, and fortunately, and I'll say, hat off to us, thanks to us, some Cube.
And yeah, they didn't even have Cube on the menu, right?
What's up with that?
Or we were totally the people that were outside of the normal situation here, right? We just kind of said, you know what would be really great? Cube. But before we go any further down this conversation and talk about this event and the things that we learned from it, myself, Chris, and Stu, we're going to just do the thing that we always do here at UberCube. We're going to enjoy our libations of the show. Let's start out with Chris. What are you having, sir?
Unfortunately tonight, not drinking tonight, having some coffee. That's all I'm doing right now. Can't have any right now. So here we are.
Stay
Cheers.
caffeinated, my friend. There's got to be a little bit more to
That's
this coffee. Tell us about what you got going on with this coffee. What flavor is it?
It's actually caramel flavored. I started liking these flavored coffees that you can get at stores like that. I like brewing those up. I think they're very tasty. Although I always drink them black. I don't put any sweetener in them. So
I do love a good roast, and Chris, we can always count on for, I make coffee at home, and I can never quite get down the roast that Chris gets oftentimes when I visit. We look forward to that every time we play Magic. How about yourself, Stu? What do you got?
I have for myself today from Modern Times Beer, based out of San Diego, California, I have their Submersible City Coconut Stout, and it's a banger. What about yourself, Anthony? What you
sounds
got?
awesome.
I'm sitting around thinking about CubeCon, which is in October, so I went and bought Sam Adams Oktoberfest, hearty and smooth, because it tastes and feels like CubeCon. There we go. Chris, you're coming to CubeCon, right?
Absolutely.
And Stu, you're coming to CubeCon, right?
That's right. Got the crew going. Excited.
The greatest 4 days of Magic. Yeah, it's going to be absolutely amazing. Oh my gosh, it's going to be so exciting. It's Chris's first CubeCon, too.
That's right.
And you have a Peasant Cube featured, is that correct?
I do.
It's
What,
gonna be
what kind
I
of
do.
cube? Let's do a little synopsis of your cube before we even get rolling down this event we're talking about. Tell the
Yeah,
listeners
it's
a little
mainly
bit about it.
It's mainly just like a more traditional style peasant cube. I support a lot of the major archetypes, like aggro control and all that fun stuff. I have a self-mill deck I got that's really fun to play. Also aristocrats, a whole lot of spells matters, all sorts of stuff. I don't run the rare lands like some do. I chose not to. It was kind of a design choice. Really do I think the fixing is great in it. It's just slow. That's the only issue. But hopefully it's a lot of fun. Can't wait to add a few of the Wilds of Eldraine cards as well. Got some of those in order already.
We have a future episode coming out soon where we're going to chat about Wilds of Eldraine, because I think the listeners, I know for a fact that we've had a lot of listeners that have said, hey, we want to know more about Pauper and Peasant, and you being the person that's most
The expert.
engage with that topic, right? You're the expert.
Let's say that.
And we really look to you and lean on you to be able to tell us more about that particular environment, because I'm a thematic builder, and someday we're hoping for this Doom Cube, hopefully before, I don't know. It's going to happen, because I'd like to talk about Stu's Doom Cube on this year's holiday edition, which will be our October edition. But I think, where are we at with that, Stu? Is it coming along?
It's percolating. It's bubbling along. It's bubbling along.
But we're not here to talk about these cubes now, are we? We're here to talk about the event that we went to, which was just absolutely amazing, the Gathering. And we got to fire 3 drafts, which was absolutely amazing. On Saturday the 19th, myself and Stu got to go out and we fired Uber Bear's Artifact Cube, and then we fired Uber Bear's Horror Cube. And then on Sunday, myself and Chris went out and decided to go fire Uber's Two-Headed Giant Cube. And we've got a lot of data, a lot of information, and we just sat back and watched and let the players do the thing, the drafters, right? And it was really fun. What'd you guys think about it, guys?
I thought it was great. I will say I was there for the Saturday. Chris was on the Sunday. Anthony was there both days. First of all, the event itself, I will comment on the event. The event was incredibly well put together. A lot of people there, obviously with the stand of the tournaments that they were having, like Legacy, Modern, Vintage. A lot of players there who were playing to win, and you could tell that the vibe in the room, certainly on the Saturday that I was there was a lot of players who, they were serious about it. They weren't there to show up and just kind of look pretty or just kind of have fun. A lot of people were there because they wanted to win. They were min-maxing, they're playing, their scam modern decks, or we had our good friend Bill who showed up and played Legacy Dredge. And what I was excited about seeing was, as we saw at CubeCon, it was a different vibe than what we may get when we're just drafting and hanging out and having a few beers at one of our houses and we're drafting a cube. I was interested to see what's it going to be like with these people who are much more competitive, have that competitive mindset, right? They're there at a Magic tournament to win. They're there to spend money on a tournament and to win. It wasn't a huge amount, like $40-50 for entry, but they were there to win. And the competitive nature did not disappoint, even though you could tell that the attitudes of the players were that they were coming along to our little fiefdom, right? To have a bit of fun, maybe separate themselves away from that hardcore competitive side. But to me, it just looked like it was fun with that kind of competitive vibe kind of added onto it. I don't know if you guys kind of feel the same way about it.
Yeah, I could see that too. And I was only there on the Sunday. I didn't see the Artifact of the Horror Cube fire. But definitely the cool part about the Two-Headed Giant is that there was teams of 2 people, and then everyone, working together. And it was really neat to watch them build their decks and then work together as they were playing the games. That's why the games took longer, because there was a lot of talking back and forth between the two of them about, should I play? What should I do this then? And sequencing and everything. But everyone was like laser beam focused because they were more competitive players. Yep. These are the players who are playing the Modern and the Legacy and the Vintage and everything like that. And I just thought it was really interesting to watch that dynamic. Because like I said, when we're playing at our houses, we're loosey goosey with a lot of stuff. We just play for fun. We're not cutthroat, kind of thing. We're just playing with each other like that. But it was neat to see, and it was neat to see the kind of different kind of decks that people build. I always love to see that, especially people who definitely don't think the same way I do. That's for sure when it comes to this. And it's amazing to watch what they come up with.
It was interesting. That's funny you should mention that. I did see the laser eyes myself a little bit, right? But the cubes themselves, so the buy-in for the cube was significantly different than the rest of the competitive matches. The outcome the prize pool was different. And I want to thank the Gathering Place for providing chaos pack per win type of situation, right? But then we have to give a special shout out to our good friend, Stephen Konefal, who provided Dominaria United and Modern Masters 2, gave 2 full bundles of it. So I was able to pass out, I think, was it like 72 packs, right? 36 per?
It was a box each of Dominaria United and actually Modern Horizons 2. And I'm not going to lie, I was a little jealous at watching some of the pulls that were coming out of those packs because plenty of our players, they hit some bangers. I was watching Fetch Lands and Urza Sagas and stuff like that get pulled. So, definitely, obviously we charged a bit of money because it was all going to such a great cause. But again, thank you to Stephen. What a legend for providing that prize support, and to see the looks on the players' faces when they were opening those packs, and even the ones that weren't quite as successful with the draft. I know that feeling, but to see them be able to have the fun and get something cool out of it as well was really cool. So again, Stephen, you're a legend. We thank you very much.
Which was really interesting because, like I said, the laser eyes, right? But it was $20 per player for the buy-in to go to Extra Life, the Children's Miracle Network, Duke Hospital, which I want to thank you for allowing us to join such an amazing charity in itself, right? But what was interesting is the players didn't know what they were there to win for, right? I mean, I felt like Santa Claus during this event because of our good friend Steven. And I mean, Chris, by that second day, we got a little nutty. I think we had like 42 packs left. And I was doing like, you unlocked Uber Bear's secret thing. You mass polymorphed, or you did some goofy stuff, which we'll talk about here shortly. But it was funny to watch the players, or for the fact that you just played and you won. And they didn't come in there with any expectations. Sure, over on the left-hand side of the room, it was very straight-edged. I'm there for competitive Magic. But it was so cool to take some of these individuals, which we'll talk about here very shortly, but to take them out of that element and put them into Cube. And yeah, sure, they were laserized, but the fun, you could see the fun on their faces. I mean, yes. Chris, you had to have seen that, right? They were enjoying the teamwork aspect of doing the two-headed giant. It was just... What are your thoughts on that?
There's a lot of laughing, a lot of smiling. It was really cool. People were really just like, "Oh, that's really cool." They're seeing these really awesome lines of play, especially when they could use their teammate, as the two-headed giant, of course, as you're supposed to do a two-headed giant, work together. And when they see these interactions and the work, it was really cool to watch.
I will say,
I think that really speaks to the power of Cube, right?
And the power level, which was interesting, right? Because again, you think about what you're playing in Legacy and Vintage and Modern, and this was no power cube environment. This was a two-headed giant cube, which has got some powerful cards in it, but it's no Legacy or Vintage cube even, right? So what I thought was interesting was seeing these guys who are competitive players, who are, again, playing these hyper-competitive, hyper-powerful decks relative to the format, and they were opening these packs, and they were looking at me like, what on earth is this? What card is this? Where did this come from? What set was this released in? I have never seen this card. Yeah, you're never going to see a werewolf if you're playing in Modern or Legacy or Vintage. Like, these cards they're like, what? Where did this come from?
It was even crazier in the two-headed giant. Even crazier in two-headed giant because they're playing a lot of cards that are only played in multiplayer.
Right.
So it's like
I'm sad I missed that.
And it was awesome to see. So it's like, what the heck is this? What the heck is...
Yeah, that's we saw people light up. So I feel like we'd be doing a severe injustice if we didn't talk about our good friend Kirby. And Kirby 3-0'd on day one, which was the Saturday for UberCube, right? The Artifact and the Horror Cube. I mean, just absolutely crushed the game. And they didn't crush it in a bad way, as in crush it because Kirby is a really good player. I just want to give a shout out to our good friend. And we've got some of the included in the show notes. We have some images of the decks and in our Deck Boast channel, which Kirby included because we asked him to, right?
I'd be interested. Put in like... I'd be interested to see if there was any study done of this Artifact cube, because he showed up. He's like, yeah, I'm excited to draft the cube. And we do have the deck that he drafted in the show notes, but I'm going to read off a few of the sort of the highlight cards. So he drafted, it was a Artifact themed rug deck. And you look at some of the choices and they just look very obvious. But then you look at it in the grand scheme of the deck and it looks really, really nice. It's not really any surprise that he went 3-0. So he's got things like Goldmere, Chief Engineer, Reality Chip, Icar Wellspring is in here. Tireless Tracker is in there, which I think is a wonderful card in so many archetypes, but just plays so nicely in these artifacts as well. Emery, Lurker of the Loke, so good. Grafted War Gear. Mystic Forge, which to me is just an epitome of like a fun card in this kind of archetype. I love it so much. So yeah, I don't know if he did his homework or not, but if he did, congratulations. And if you didn't, even more congratulations, because this is a really cool deck that was drafted by Kirby. Well done.
Well, Kirby might have had a little bit of home field advantage because we did hang out with Kirby. Kirby was part of the former SEG crew, right? He's got skills. And when Kirby came out, we got to meet him at SEG Con Charlotte, if I'm not mistaken. And I know that he had played Uber Bear's Horror Cube. I cannot recall in Kirby. I'll ask you this. Did you play Uber Bear's Artifact Cube? Because what Kirby did, and again, we're going to make this the Kirby episode, the secret Kirby episode, is Kirby did a fantastic job of giving feedback, right? Uber Bear's Horror Cube is better because of Kirby and the SEG Star City Games crew that was hanging out with Kirby that gave me immediate feedback, which is something that curators oftentimes don't get. Like people, I mean, Chris probably experiences this where sometimes people sugarcoat their responses a little bit too much. And Kirby was pretty direct about his feedback and what I could do a little bit better.
So it looks like Kirby had Erectus Vampires Aristocrats that he made your horror cube. Went 3-0, I'm assuming, correct?
Yes.
That is correct.
Yeah. Dang, this looks awesome. It looks like it's got a bunch of very aggressive. It's got a bunch of 1-drops, 2-drops, Cruel Celebrant, just a whole bunch of removal, it looks like, as well.
Yeah, Kirby kind of built removal.deck with Aristocrats kind of carrying the back of it. And that was an interesting deck to watch emerge from Uber Bear's Horror Cube, which is also featured at CubeCon. But it was neat to see someone take this to the limits. And it was just really cool and 3-0'd. And again, Kirby 3-0'd both in Uber Bear's Artifact Cube with kind of a rug type of, I'll call it a pseudo aristocrats, kind of, because it had pieces in there that not only hated artifacts but also punished for artifacts. But then to watch a similar player of high skill level also do the same thing in Uber Bear's Horror Cube, play kind of a Mardu aristocrats. It was just neat to watch all these unfold. But good job, Kirby. Kirby crushed the game in both these, 3-0'd on Saturday. And it was kind of a running joke, like, Kirby, you're not allowed to play on Sunday.
That deck is like half of a EDH deck almost, it looks like. If someone said, hey, this is, 40 cards out of a commander deck that I pulled out, I'd be like, yeah, that looks about right. So the fact that he put this together out of a cube, I think is quite impressive. Very nicely done.
Yeah, and it's interesting that Kirby was able to flush out these two different archetypes out of the cube, which I've got distinguished signpost for, but it's really cool to see them come together with such synergies. And not only did Kirby crush the game here at Uber Bear's Artifact Cube and Uber Bear's Horror Cube, but also we had some other guests that showed up, and I wanted to give a shout out for them and say thank you for showing up. And these will be more of the Discord names, and they'll know who I'm talking to, but Roland of Gan and Joshy 4. And then Harmless Fuzzball.
Love that.
And my question about Harmless Fuzzball is, any fuzzball really harmless? Question mark.
He was really right. Everyone was really harmless.
But what was neat out of all these decks that emerged is I told you that there were like these secret I'm passing out packs for people that did a thing that made me excited that I didn't know my cube could do. And one of the things that I've waited for 10 years in the making, and Chris is probably one of the only people on the planet that knows that I've been waiting for this forever, was Mikaeus versus Mikaeus.
And you have mentioned this before. Absolutely have mentioned this before.
And it's 10 years it took for this to ever happen. And it was Mikaeus the Unhallowed versus Mikaeus the Lunarch. It finally happened where we got a Mikaeus the Unhallowed, which for players that aren't familiar, I will include those in the show notes, but I will also read them because I can't help myself. This was kind of a live the dream for me as a cube curator to watch these two face off, because for thematic purposes, I've included this in my Uber Bear's Horror Cube because, it's literally the before and after of what happened to our good, sweet friend Mikaeus. Mikaeus the Lunarch is X. Pay 1 planes, legendary creature, human cleric. Mikaeus the Lunarch enters the battlefield with X 1/1 counters on it. Tap, put a 1/1 counter on Mikaeus. Tap, remove a 1/1 counter from Mikaeus, put a 1/1 counter on each other creature you control. And it's a 0/0 base stat. That's where the X comes in. But then we have Mikaeus after Innistrad went south. And it was Mikaeus the Unhallowed. Things went really wrong in the world of Innistrad. It really did. And for 3 colorless and 3 swamps, you had legendary creature, zombie cleric. Intimidate. Whenever a human deals damage to you, destroy it. Other non-human creatures you control get +1/+1 and have Undying. Undying is whenever it dies, it comes back with a +1/+1 counter on it. Everybody gets the idea. But what's really neat is the person that was playing Micaeus the Lunarch actually put 5 counters on it. The person had Micaeus Unhallowed have 5 life. It was just like Micaeus pass. It was fantastic. As a curator, that was kind of my highlight of the event. What did you think about that one, Chris?
I mean, it sounds really cool. I really do like it.
Yeah, so that was kind of the live the dream for me, not to, take off of David McDarby, but Micaeus versus Micaeus was just something that I dreamt up 10 years ago. I think it's probably plus 10 years right now. We've been playing this Uber Bears Horror Cube forever. Chris, what do you think about that?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's awesome that someone was able to pull that off. And it was on opposing sides. Someday I'd like to see them both controlled by the same player. I just think that would be really neat to have like a black-white deck with both Micaeus fighting side by side.
Oh my God, you're going to make me wait 20
it's a
years.
non-bo. I understand it's a non-bo. I understand that, but I still love it. I understand it's a non-bo.
Yeah. So what was interesting about this event is, as we talked about, there were players that were laser beamed. They're there. They don't know the prize pool. Thank you, Steven. But they're unaware. All they did is pay their $20, single bracket. Basically, it wasn't really a Swiss. It was a single bracket elimination, which, it's whatever. But on day one, that's kind of the vibe we did just to move things along. But what was interesting is that players played for high stakes, even though at the time, unbeknownst to them, there weren't high stakes, right? It was a chaos pack per $20 to the charity. Thank you, Extra Life. And it was amazing to see players really put those goggles on. But what was neat for me as a curator, having players play very seriously, right? They're there for the pink slips, if you will, is that I got feedback on my cube environments that, as Chris mentioned before, we play a very casual type of Magic. Stu, would you agree?
When I eventually get to play Magic again, because it's been a little while, then I will say. But yeah, we mentioned that earlier. We do tend to play for fun, right? I want to play to enjoy the draft, which I enjoy the most. I want to enjoy playing Magic, which I do certainly enjoy. And I want to enjoy the company, right? Because we're hanging out, we're at someone's house, goofing off and playing some Magic. This was a very different, like you say, much more competitive, much more cutthroat, as Chris mentioned. Love that, because that really does seem to embody the attitude that the players had when they showed up. I will say this, it felt like that cutthroat, hyper-competitive attitude that they had when they sat down really did start to drop off a little bit once they started opening packs and realizing that they didn't know half the cards, and realizing that, look, you're here to win, don't get me wrong. You sit down and play a game, you want to win. But the majority of what you're here for is to have fun and support the cause and just enjoy yourself. And I felt like that was the kind of interaction that even, like, no one knows when they sit down that you're hoping to see Micaeus against Micaeus, but they're going to thrive and feed off that kind of enthusiasm and that kind of excitement when something like that happens. So that's what I love about going to an event like this and having a bunch of players sit down and draft a cube that are so unfamiliar with it and are just doing it for the experience.
Which really played in that psychodynamics that we talked about on the previous
episode. A lot
of
spikes. Spikes galore at the event.
Yeah, the spikes showed up, right? But as May has said, and as the lore of spikes has said, they overcome and adapt. They still wanted to find those winning lines, even though these cubes were definitely not in comparison with those modern 5Ks they were doing, those legacy vintage tournaments they were doing. So they kind of took themselves out of that element. And then it was so interesting to watch players like, oh, cube, what is cube, right? And then they sit down like, I've never played cube before. And that was what's so fascinating is we had numerous players. I think we ended up seating out of this event 26 players, and I'll explain that shortly, but we did 8, and 8, and then there was a boss fight that we'll talk about very shortly. But it was so neat to watch players come outside of their element, adapt and overcome. And I think that's something that cube exclusively can do, right? It's kind of like a limited draft when you go and do a sealed play. If you haven't done any research and you start cracking packs, you just realize that you can use this whole bread concept, if you will, right? And I watched players kind of play to the bread acronym. It was, what is it? It's
bombs removal. something, something, something.
Evasion, aggressive,
removal,
and the dredges.
Yeah,
you kind of got it right.
The dregs.
The dregs.
Yeah.
And you watch these players kind of just look through this cube and find out like what worked for them. So the spikes did the spiky thing, but then they toned it back to the environment. Because as we mentioned before, a lot of these players have never had the opportunity to ever cube before. I think Chris actually, when we sat down, it was like, I've never played cube before, but I'm fascinated because this event's only a $20 buy-in to the charity. And they were just looking for something to do, right? In the interim, some of these players were finding a medium in between their matches. Maybe they're waiting for the next round of Legacy or whatever. That's what Stu and I experienced. And I'm like, I'll sit down and play some Cube. And it's really cool to get to introduce this. And at first, I was really nervous as a curator. And I imagine the Game Star was too, right? Like they're announcing, we're hosting Uber Bears Artifact Cube. And everybody's like, what the hell is that? And then people started signing up and they come over and they're like, I'll give you $20. And it was just really neat to see the charity actually get something out of that, but watch players adapt and overcome.
I think it's
that's
interesting.
Really speaks to what Cube can do.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you mentioned limited, right? Because limited is one of the closest, if not the closest, other formats to playing Cube, right? You kind of understand where the list is, you get the packs, build deck and so on and so forth. When we went to CubeCon and I was going around talking to people like, what kind of Magic do you play? A lot of people at CubeCon stated themselves as limited players. They were not modern players or legacy players. A lot of them didn't play Commander even, which is a very popular format. But a lot of them said, no, I am a limited player. That's what I enjoy to do. I go to my store and I play limited. We play around the kitchen table, so to speak. We do. But for the most part, I enjoy limited the most. And I think that's why that the CubeCon and seeing people come and enjoy that Cube experience, and why that was such a popular response to that question. Really, that kind of shows why there was sort of the reaction that there was from people who were constructed format specialists, right? Because the people that are showing up to play in this event, they are constructed specialists. They're playing modern, they're playing legacy and vintage. So it was cool to see that the different attitude from the people who are showing up at this event, competitive, to CubeCon, not so much, but definitely like the mindset of the player and where they sort of saw themselves fit into the landscape in the different formats.
I think what I like seeing is when people who are very spiky like that come to a cube like the Horror Cube or the Artifact Cube. They're not the most hyper competitive kind of lists. They're not like your usual vintage cube. They're kind of forced into a mindset that they can take the efficient cards, but they may have to branch out of their wheelhouse, so to speak, where they've got to take cards that fit in more of a synergy than, let's say, a power level. So this card A might be really powerful, but card B makes this deck hum. So it's where they have to make decisions like that and kind of get out of their wheelhouse and not be as spiky when it comes to certain picks.
Yeah,
and I love that about Cube.
Yeah,
so that's
I agree. I think it's familiarity, which is such a huge thing, right? Because certainly with the amount of content out there, you don't have to go very far on YouTube or Twitch to find people drafting Cube, but 9 times out of 10, they're going to be drafting the vintage Cube. It's a popular cube on Magic Online. So that's where, and when you look at Magic Online, you look at the lists, there's not going to be too many cards on those lists, right? Certainly on the vintage cube, that a lot of enfranchised players aren't going to be familiar with. Everybody knows what Black Lotus and the Marks and Time Walk and Ancestral Recall and even a lot of the creatures and planeswalkers. They're very, very familiar with a lot of those cards. And then you come and play a horror cube or an artifact theme cube, and there's a lot of cards in those cubes that there's going to be some familiarity with. But there's a lot of cards that you're just going to be like, man, I've never seen this card before. At least the players that are those enfranchised and certainly the competitive players, they're, like I said before, they're just not going to have any familiarity with it. So it's cool to see the sort of the tick 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 in the brains going like, okay, how do I make this card work? Does it work in the deck I'm currently drafting? Could it potentially be a power outlier? Is it a build around card? Obviously, it helps to read the overviews and the primers on Cube Cobra so you can get those ideas. But again, really cool to see the minds at work.
And it was really neat, like the lessons learned type of aspect. We talked about that in a previous episode, where we've now got players that are there for a different type of event. And they were not expecting Cube. Granted, some of these actually were familiar with the UberCubePodcast and other podcasts like Lucky Paper Radio, etc. So they kind of had an expectation of what we were trying to do as curators, but they were a little bit outside their comfort zone, as Chris kind of mentioned, but they were able to adapt. But what was neat to see players actually from this hyper competitive environment give feedback like this card works, this card doesn't work, and or we got to see cards while playing. Chris and I on day 2 in particular got to see cards play not quite the way that I intended them to play. And one of the conversations that Chris and I had on the way back on the Sunday post Uber Bears two-headed giant cube was about the card Strip Mine. Chris, do you want to talk about what you and I talked about on the car ride home and about how it played and what I intended as a curator? I had to eat some pie here. Little humble
Yeah,
pie, if you will.
when I think of Strip Mine, first of all, just put it. Strip Mine's a busted card.
Yeah.
I mean, I think nobody can deny that. It's just a land that destroys any land, and it costs no deck building cost whatsoever, other than the fact it produces colorless. That's its only drawback. And the way that I've always played Strip Mine, and apparently this was different from the way Anthony was thinking about it.
Yes.
I always played Strip Mine in a very aggressive way. Like, Strip Mine is a very early pick if you want to go in an aggressive deck. Even some decks that aren't aggressive want it as well, just to set that opponent back a step, get them on the back foot. That's to me how you play Strip Mine, and that's how I've always played it. But that's not quite what Anthony told me. Anthony told me he saw it more of a defensive play against his more utility lands.
Yes.
And the way that I saw that was, well, if I were playing against, even if they had what do you call it? The one that gives trample plus X and trample, or Gathering Township is the other one that gives the counters. Keswick
Wolf Run, and Gathering Township. Which I'll read Gathering Township. And so I apologize for cutting you off, but so in my mindset, I needed to have a strip mined effect, which is like Chris had mentioned, it could destroy any land as a countermeasure to ultra powerful lands within my cube environment, because oftentimes you don't find instants or sorceries like Beast Within, which I do run in Uber Bears Horror Cube, but it's not a lot of them. Vindicate effects, etc., stuff that can hit lands or non-basic lands that represent real threats in the cube environment. And what was interesting to watch these hyper competitive players come in, and they started doing the thing that Chris just labeled as, I'm going to play this as an aggressive player. For me, in my mind as a curator, I needed them to counterbalance stuff like Gathering Township, which is a land, tap, 1 colorless for your mana pool, sure. But you can also play 2 and a Selesnya, tap, put a 1/1 counter on each creature you control. And my mindset as a curator in Uber Bears Horror Cube is that I needed a counterbalance, Strip Mine, to remove a card threat like Gathering Township. But what I had kind of separated from the idea, and this is the lessons learned part, everybody learns every time you watch a draft, but now we've got hyper aggressive legacy vintage players, right, sitting down to play cube. And they're there, I'm not saying they're for a different reason, but they're there for a quote unquote different reason, and they want to play to win. They're now taking a card that I thought that I would use in my casual Magic, hanging out with Chris and Stu and all of our friends, and I would blow up your Gathering Township. But instead, I watched the player use Life from the Loam and try to do a Strip Mine lock in Uber Bears Horror Cube, which is way opposite of what I intended. I guess I put the goggles on. I was a little bit naive, I guess, is what I'm looking at. And I do realize when we go to CubeCon 2023, where this cube is featured, players are there to play cube. Cube is a great time, right? But players are also there to top 8 at the end of the day. Would you agree, Stu?
I would, and I will agree with Chris. Strip Mine is an aggressive card. And I put this is kind of, and I don't know if this is the way that other people will look at this, but this is the way I do. I do, like I say, do look at it as aggressive. I look at it as a card the similar way that I would to something like a counter spell or a removal spell, right? It's a removal spell. It removes a land. I want this to do a job. And typically the job that I want it to do, same as I do a counter spell, same as I do a removal spell, is to slow my opponent down. Now, don't get me wrong. Gathering Township, Keswick Wolf Run, they're also very aggressive cards. But Strip Mine will be, you've played an island for turn, Are you playing a monocolored deck? Okay, I've taken you off a resource. Have you played a mountain and you're playing a 4-color deck or a 3-color deck and you really need that red mountain? I am more than happy to slow myself down one turn to aggressively take you off a land and potentially even off a color. And I don't mind not playing a creature. I don't mind not putting something out on turn 1 if it means that I can aggressively attack your resource base in order for me to gain the advantage over the next 2, 3, 4 turns. So yes, I do look at it as a card that can get rid of those aggressive lands as well, but those are aggressive on my opponent's side, and this is me being aggressive and being proactively aggressive rather than reactively aggressive.
Yeah, and the way I look at it is you're using the strip mine to take away one of their lands, so they may not ever get to activate their Gathering Township.
Yeah.
They may not ever get to activate their Kessig Wolfrun for more than 1 or 2 points of extra damage.
Yep. It's only as good as the creatures that are on the battlefield, right? And if they haven't been able to play a creature because you've stripped their land away, womp womp.
And that's the way I've always looked at it as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I chose to put, I'm the Clydesdale, galloping down St. Patrick's Day in Savannah that I can't see the parade happening around me, right? I wanted to look at this from an intent of a different viewpoint. I wanted to shroud myself and look at this from the viewpoint of a defensive mechanism that I needed to balance the scales. And that was a revelation for me as a curator. And I think that's something that a lot of curators can learn from, is that when we look at a card, maybe we don't want to see it the way other players see it. But it was a real wake-up call for me. It was a splash of water in my face to watch a player do exactly the thing that – and I've actually admitted on multiple podcasts that I play a very spike mentality, right? I would do that thing in a powered vintage cube. But for whatever reason, I chose to blind myself to that in Uberbear's Horror Cube. And then I don't even know why I had it in Uberbear's Artifact Cube, but Horror Cube, I had I believe a justifiable reason, Kessig Wolfrun, but at the end of the day, it's never been used that way. And I think a lot of times when you get these lists, and Chris can probably attest to this, the list, you kind of become blinded to your list. You scroll through it on CubeCobra or whatever Excel spreadsheet you use, and it's easy to overlook cards and not see the forest for the trees. Would you agree with that, Chris?
Yeah, I was like that in my Peasant Cube for several cards, like Icicle Scepter for the longest time. It's just too much for a peasant environment. There's just too easy to lock. It doesn't seem like it'd be that bad, but the minute someone gets locked under it, it's just like with Strip Mine. You get Strip Mine locked, the feel bads are really there, and it's just not fun. And I just don't like it. It's why I've left Strip Mine out of most of my cubes, except maybe, and I've replaced them with other effects like other destroy land effects that maybe only destroy non-basics, or they get a land in return. Because I'm just here to have fun with these. I'm not, I save that for the power cube.
So I do run stuff like Field or Ruin and things like that.
Yeah,
but
those are fine in my opinion.
Those are balanced options to still deal with the threats that are probably more targeted. I mean, you can even run like Ghost Quarter and whatever. You're still losing a card, but you're not strip mine locking them out of the game. And it was a lesson learned for me as a curator, and I think I'm better for it. So I wanted to thank all the highly competitive players for really opening my eyes up to this, because I should have seen it. I just chose to, I don't know, turn a blind eye to it, I guess. I don't know.
I think you might have thought differently. You might have
Anthony,
thought
you
differently
weren't
in
wrong
the context of another
about wanting it to destroy Kessig Wolfrun and Gathering Township. You weren't wrong. That is definitely a use of it. There's a defensive use for it, but most people don't see it that way, unfortunately.
Yeah, you're looking at it as, here's what I've got it in, and then you're looking at the lands and you're laser beaming your focus on those lands that you decided to put it in for, not realizing obviously that anyone that understands how powerful it is and knows that they want to be aggressive with it. I'm very, very happy to play on turn 1, strip their first land. I'm not sitting around waiting for a Kessig Wolfrun or a Gathering Township. For all I know, they don't have that land. For all I know, they're never going to draw that land, even if they do have it. So getting that aggressive early playing and getting that advantage, that's why, again, as Chris said, that's why it's so completely busted. It hits any land, and it taps for colorless, even if you get to, if you're not too interested and you just want to play aggressively out of your hand. Yeah, it's busted, and that hyper-aggressive early plays with it can be so swingy in a game.
Which leads us to the next card that I want to talk about, because we got active feedback, which was really neat between the 2 days. And the players, while I said they were lasered eyes, they actually had intent to. Most of everybody actually enjoyed the cube, right? They had a great time. And what I enjoyed about what cube does is it opens discussion. And the next part that was fascinating to me is I have this other card that I've had on a watch list for a while. I knew when I added it that it was a potential problem, but I'll explain how this card is super weird in a juxtaposition. But then when I got to play with Kirby and the SEG crew, which forgive me, but forgive me, I don't know the other individuals' names. But what was fascinating is I got all this active feedback, and this one card, and it was just this card is too powerful. And then other games, this game would be it was nothing at best. It was Curious Herd. For 3 colorless and 1 forest, you get an instant. Choose target opponent, which is the person sitting across from you. You create X 3/3 green beast creature tokens, where X is the number of artifacts that player controls. Now, this was inside of Uberbear's artifact cube. And I want to do my turtle up defensive position, and then I'm going to ask Stu and Chris for their feedback on this. But what I thought when I put Curious Herd in there is that green as a color, and this is from CubeCon #1, wanted to simply destroy artifacts. That was my artifact versus anti-artifact principles, which we've talked about in multiple episodes, and we'll talk about in the future episode here before we go to CubeCon. But the gist was I'm looking for interesting cards that from Selesnya package that doesn't simply hate artifacts. But this card creates an army because the opponent across from you is just playing the game of Magic, or the promise, as Derek Gallen has said, that I've presented before them. The card looks harmless on paper, right? Because green wants to remove artifacts. And it's really swingy because a lot of stuff you're running in Uberbear's Artifact Cube is for the sole purpose of naturalizing an artifact effect. But then you've got this weird card that's in total juxtaposition of the rest of the cube that says, well, I'm going to allow them to have their artifacts, but then I'm going to gain a reward. And so the card just, it doesn't make any sense. What do you think about that, Chris?
The reason I think I've pointed this card out before in the past as a possible problem. I wasn't sure if it would be or not. I've played it a few times in yours, and the thing I liked about it was it's very splashable. You don't have to run it in a straight green deck. It's only 1 green pip, and for 3 colors. But it's weird in that it doesn't punish them for playing a whole lot. Sort of, it doesn't destroy any of their things. But if they have let's say they have 8 artifacts, you just made 8 3/3s, usually on their end step, kind of thing. And it can be hard, but it can also do literally almost nothing. Let's say that they're not playing the artifact deck. They're not playing the major artifacts. They're not playing a lot of artifact tokens. I've had it where this thing maybe makes 2, and it's just not worth it at that point. So it's like, you're right. It either does a whole lot or it does a whole lot of nothing. Or the
ceiling and floors are all over the place for this card.
Yeah, in fact, it costs 4, makes it hurt when it does nothing.
I don't know if I would say. Yeah. Do you think 2 3/3s for 4 mana is do nothing? I don't know if 2 3/3s at 6 power, 6 toughness for only.
You're right.
4 mana.
It's not totally do nothing.
I think that's pretty strong. I think, and first of all, go back to what you said. How splashable it is. I couldn't agree more. The fact that it's only 1 green pip makes this card so very strong in, again, the thematic, maybe a little underpowered environment. Number 2, going back to what Anthony said, yes, you're thinking about this green artifact versus anti-artifact, right? First of all, you can only destroy so many artifacts. If you had just dumped everything in green, that creeping corrosion and every single anti-artifact card that had ever been printed, then yeah, okay, then that might give green the ability to destroy literally every single artifact. But for the most part, it doesn't want to do that. Plus, you don't care about your own artifacts. It's only your opponent's artifacts. So you don't even need to kill the artifacts on their side that you don't care about. Hey, you want to create 10 treasures? Knock yourself out. You want to put some equipment on the battlefield? Feel free. You can then have that control over what you care about on your opponent's side, and then just when it gets to that critical mass, which I don't really think needs to be much, 3 or more, I am super happy. If it's 2, maybe I'm playing it a little bit more defensively or I'm trying to close the game out. But if it's 3 or more and I'm getting 9 power and 9 toughness on the battlefield for 1 card and 4 mana, I'm super excited, and I can definitely tell why. Anytime you're sitting down, and again, going back to the vibe of the cube, which is, it's not just artifacts versus anti-artifacts. It's a cube where artifacts are a theme. Anytime you've got a bunch of artifacts out, which players are likely to do, you've just got this built-in, super efficient card that provides a boatload of value, that's hyper splashable, and there's just no downside to it whatsoever. So to me, this is why I can see why Chris wanted to put it on the watch list, and to me why I don't know if I'm pick one, pack one in it, but I'm taking it very highly.
I've always picked this very early if I've seen it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And because even if I'm not in green, I'll take it. I'll find a land. Yep. I'll find a land or two to be able to run this
There's
thing.
plenty of good fixing in that cube, and you only need one green pip. So yeah.
Yep,
which
I'll find
really speaks to the problem of this card, right? So players are looking at it differently than the curator, right? So I did again ask Kirby's crew, hey, just like May said before, I'm not going to give you a problem without providing you a solution. I'm not going to tell you cut without giving you an addition. So I said, all right, well, you understand my intent here, right? What should I add opposed to Curious Herd? And I got quite the remarkable card offered to me, and I'll explain why. It was Sweet Gum Recluse for 4 colorless and 2 forest. Creature Spider grosses me out. I'm arachnophobic. Anybody knows me, but I can't look at the card, but it's in my cube now, right? It's a 0/3. Has Flash, Cascade. So Cascade, let's talk about that for a minute. In a recent episode where we talked about to David McDarby, I fell in love with the Live the Dream Cube. I loved it when we went to SCG Con Richmond. Stu and I got a chance to play it. We talked about it in a recent episode, and I just like that dynamic. So that hit hard for me, and I just totally didn't think about this card. It has reach. When Sweet Gum Recluse enters the battlefield, put 3 1/1 counters on each of any target creatures that entered the battlefield this turn, which is fascinating to me because this was mentioned to me by a player that's thinking about it at a different level. I would have never thought about this card for an artifact cube. Chris, I mentioned this to you. What was the thing I missed here? What was the mechanic that works well with this?
Oh, the modular package. Yeah, the +1/+1 counters work really well with that. You got a whole bunch of little modular artifact critters, and it works really well with that.
You know what I would love to hit with a Sweet Gum Recluse and that Cascade? I sure would love to hit a Curious Herd and get all those sweet 3/3s into play, and then put all those 3 +1/+1 counters on all, because it's 3 +1/+1 counters on each of any number, not spread 3. It's 3 +1/+1 counters on each of them. So let's say I've got 3, I don't know, and I get another 9 power on the battlefield. I'm liking that. I'm liking that. Put those in together, please, Anthony. I want to play that.
Yeah, a bunch of 6/6s, right? It makes a bunch of 6/6s. Isn't that great?
That's right. Nothing.
Yeah, I'll just brainstorm in response to the Cascade trigger.
So who knew when I started playing with a bunch of semi or professional Magic players that I would learn something, right? That was what was really neat. So I kind of got the answer for the Curious Herd, but as I told you before, I mentioned the Strip Mine versus the Keswick Wolf Run, the Gavity Township. Reset my mindset on that because they're like, hey, why don't you just use Spotted Removal to deal with those creatures and Beast Withins? I'm like, yeah, but then they said, well, if I'm going to tell you something that you should cut for Strip Mine, I'm like, well, I don't know what to do. Well, another package that popped up during Uber Bear's Horror Cube, because we're bouncing back and forth from cubes as we do, because they were both featured at this event on that Saturday, was, okay, well, the individual said, hey, Strip Mine is great. I like it a lot, but what would be more cohesive of what you're trying to do here? What archetype is faltering? I'm like, well, my self-mill kind of struggles sometimes. Like, whoa, it's funny you should mention that. We've got a new card that just came out in Lord of the Rings. I'm like, oh, what is it? And then I sent Chris on a quest to go find this card for me as he got it from the table. But it was Palantir of Ornthak. For 3 colorless, you get a legendary artifact. At the beginning of your end step, put an influence counter on Palantir of Ornthak. And scry 2. Then target opponent may have you draw a card. If that player doesn't, you mill X cards, where X is the number of influence counters on Palantir of Ornthak. That's not fun to say. I didn't read Lord of the Rings. And that player loses life equal to the total mana value of those cards. This card is super powerful. I did not even notice it when it came out. Would not even have considered it. But I had another one of those players, bigger brain than me, say, "Hey, I'm not going to just give you a problem with your strip mine. I'm not just giving you a problem with your curious herd without giving you a solution." And thank you so much. That was what was amazing about this event. So Chris went on the quest, and he came back about 5 minutes later, and he said, "Oh man, they got a sweet foil." I'm like, "Yes, yes."
Yes.
This is a strong card. So yeah, Palantir of Ornithopter. I will say, I think this card is very, very, very good. If we're gonna not read them correctly, let's just do it. Let's have some fun with it. I love it from a self-mill perspective. I also love it. The damage ability for me. I love cards like this that reward players for playing high CMC cards. I love that. And this definitely does. This is seeing a lot of play right now, and for a very good reason.
Yeah, this card's sweet. I think it's really cool. I really like the card a lot. To me, it's almost good enough to go in like a powered environment too. I think it's really neat.
I would agree.
like it a lot.
I think it's vintage.
I think it's fun.
It is. I think it might be in the Moto Vintage Cube. I think it is in that list, and I think rightly so.
Oh, is it? Okay.
I'm pretty sure it is, and like I say, rightly so. I think it's amazing.
So that was kind of day one, right? Uber Bears Artifact Cube, Uber Bears Horror Cube. Got lots of feedback from amazing players, not curators, just straight up players. And they gave active feedback. They gave diversity of insight, which we preach all the time here. And some of these were a little tough for me to swallow, as most curators would fully understand, right? I had to learn something on that day. But I did. I moved on. I took the advice. And what was really assuring, going back to a little shout out for our good friend Kirby, who had the opportunity, unbeknownst to the rest of the team here playing against this individual, is that Uber Bears Horror Cube had been played previously by Kirby and his friends at SEG Con Charlotte. And what I did get that was a little reassuring that was really great, thank you, Kirby, is that he felt that Uber Bears Horror Cube is now balanced and ready for some serious play. Uber Bears Artifact Cube had to have a little bit of tweaking, but here we are, right? And then, Chris, you know this as a curator. We learn, we observe, we report, and we make changes, ever so subtly. But, we do. We learn. We get better.
Of course, you got to be able to take the feedback. For the most part, it's going to be constructive. People aren't sitting there calling your cube stupid or anything like that. They're actually just saying they're having fun playing it, but they said it could be better, and here's how it could be better. And that's what I like to hear as well. I always take that feedback.
And I think what Anthony mentioned about having, when it comes to any kind of, dare I say, criticism, because ultimately I suppose that's what you kind of have to look at it as. I never like to say, just this card is bad, remove that card, or I don't like that card. I'm always like to believe that I have the mindset of, if I'm coming to you as a curator, and I've mentioned this on previous episodes, as I think this card needs to be replaced, either overpowered, underpowered, whatever the reason may be, doesn't fit, here is an alternative. And I think this is another thing that's so great about getting this feedback from all these enfranchised players, obviously competitive players, is that they are experienced enough within the game to be able to not just say this card sucks, get rid of it, but also this card should be removed. Here's a replacement that I think would work better within the theme of the environment or whatever you're trying to do with the cube. So that was really cool to see as well.
So let's move over to day two, right? Day two was a different vibe. So day one was 1v1. We're going to call it, quote unquote, single elimination hyper competitive. Would you agree, Stu? It was kind of a vibe, right? It was, I would agree, trophying at best, right?
Yes, I would agree with that. Yes, very competitive. The laser goggles were on for sure.
So day two was a different critter altogether. I mean, it was announced as two-headed giant cube out the gate. So players, while they want to win, they had picked their partners, but Chris and I got a whole different type of vibe, right? Like by now, people are talking about the day before's cube experience. Now the signups filled up very quickly on the two-headed giant cube. And it was interesting. Like they already had the day before, after around 8 p.m., we already had the two-headed giant cube booked up, ready, locked, and loaded, right? Like I didn't even have to wait for players to sign up for that. They knew what, they came there with intent, but it was a different type of vibe. It was like, I love two-headed giant. I love doing some sealed two-headed giant. It's my jam. I don't know anything about what you're talking about. What is cube? This makes no sense to me. But I know what two-headed giant, and I've got my partner, and they're sitting to the left of me. And it was. Would you agree, Chris? It was a different vibe, right?
Yeah, everyone seemed very eager and wanted to do it. We're excited the fact that they get to do it with a partner.
So I want to talk about kind of the gist here. So this was the treasure trove. Again, thank you to Stephen Conefall. The packs were prevalent this time around. Nobody even knew. I had some super dumb secret Uber Bear unlock stuff, right? Like I was passing out packs like, oh man, you did the mass polymorph. Here, take 3 packs, whatever. But it was fantastic. It was a different vibe. And oh boy, did we have a good time on this day. But what was really interesting is we had the 8 players that we talked about, because that's what my cube can host is basically 4 teams, if I got that right. And then we decided to do something kind of weird. I can actually host 10 players, which makes no sense in a 2-headed giant cube. I do that for the purposes of diversity. I run 480 cards, so you divide that by 45, you come out with some weird 11.66 nonsense. But I said, you know what? Let's do something really cool, something we never got to do before. Let's do a final boss fight. And I want to give a special thanks to our friend of the show and Twitch streamer, Ryan Nichols, who sat down, grabbed a partner, and said, you know what? I'll wait whenever they're done competing, when we're going to run through our brackets. Ryan Nichols and the team will be the final boss fight. And it made a whole different type of vibe, didn't it, Chris?
It was really neat. I thought it was really cool.
Yeah. So Ryan Nichols is known as Tron is Bad, and just an absolutely amazing individual.
You gotta love him with a handle like that. You gotta love a person who uses Tron is Bad as their Twitter handle. So yeah, huge shout out to Ryan.
Yeah. What was really interesting to see about this is something that Chris and I learned when we first sat down to do Uber Bears 2 at a giant cube. Is I had this mindset the day before we did single elimination, right, Chris? And I said, well, let's do Swiss this time around. We're going to make it more fun, because that was kind of some of the feedback we'd gotten from day one. So I said, you know what? Let's do best out of 3. Well, how long do these matches last, Chris, when they actually started lasering? It was nuts.
Well, when we play at home, matches might last 15, 20 minutes, maybe at best. Here, they were an hour. They were taking forever because there was so much talking about what they were going to play, how they're going to play it. Lots of interaction, lots of back and forth. It was really cool to see. Yeah, we had to make that decision to cut that best of 3 crap. We couldn't do that. We had to do best of 1.
We called an audible here at UberCube, and we're like, oh, man, it's going to take way too long. Hey, everybody, I know I said this, but now we're saying that, and everybody just kind of nodded their heads and said, whatever, we're still in that match. Game 1 was still on. It was like 45 minutes into the match. People are having a good time. But what was neat to see about the 2-headed giant cubes is we do here at UberCube is when Chris and I are on teams versus, let's just say, Stu and Christian, and we're having a good time. We're normally sipping some libations and chilling out. These people were actually just like telegraphing information, weren't they? They were strategizing. It was nuts.
Yeah, it was really cool to see how they would kind of lean into each other, cover up their mouth to talk, so other players couldn't see, or they weren't actually, there wasn't like a person telling the other person what to do either, which was really cool. They were both good players normally who sat down to be teams, and it was really neat to watch them work out the puzzle of this cube and figure out how to defeat their opponents.
So what was interesting though is as Chris and I mentioned, that players are communicating and talking back and forth and doing a much better job than I'd say we do in-house, right, Chris? I mean,
absolutely much better players.
They were truly telegraphing and communicating. But what was neat to see is that some cards, and Chris and I noticed this because Chris had to play the quote-unquote judge a couple of times because we want to scream judge, certain cards, while playing Uber Bear's 2-headed giant cube, bogged down the draft, and it was because of the wording. Chris, would you mind taking on the very first one that you had to address? And as soon as I got home, I cut it. It was Baylor.
Baylor, yeah. This is that 5/5 creature demon that costs 3 and 2 red, mana value of 5, and it's a flying. And it says whenever Baylor attacks or dies, choose 1 or more. Each opponent mode must target a different player. Target opponent draws 3 cards, then discards 3 cards at random. Then target opponent sacrifices a non-token artifact, or Baylor deals damage to target opponent equal to the number of cards in their hand. The confusion was opponent versus player. I apparently didn't get it right, but apparently someone much smarter than me did. So I think you found out a better ruling for this.
Yeah, so I reached out to our good friend Lucky Looter, who's the our judge that's in our Discord, and I was actually going to be a judge at CubeCon level 2, right? And I reached out and I said, "Hey, we've got some confusions." And as Chris said, let's talk about what we believed and what was the reality. So when we saw a player in Two-Headed Giant, if for those that aren't overly familiar, 30 life is shared amongst two players that becomes one player. So you treat them as a singular player. That was our belief. But then each person that represents that team is considered an opponent. So when I started getting these weird modal cards, and there's some other ones that were included in this problem, we started noticing the language on these cards, like whenever he mentioned Baylor, it said flying, whenever Baylor attacks or dies, choose one or more. Each mode must target a different player. That gets confusing. So the players are like, what? I don't understand. Which one am I? Am I a player or am I opponent? And then each mode follows as such. Target opponent draws 3 cards, then discards a card at random. Target opponent sacrifices a non-token artifact. Baylor deals damage to a target opponent equal to the number of cards in their hand. Well, there's only 2 opponents, but there's also 1 player. But then, after talking to Lucky Looter, I wish I had you there during this event. Players are just like, I don't even know how to play this card because there's 3 modes, right? And there's only 2 players. And that bogged down the game. Let's just call a spade, right?
Technically,
Yeah.
there's not. There's 4 players, right? But there's only 2 opponents. You have 2 opponents, and you're right that they are. You could kind of look at them as a team, even though you attack them as one opponent, but they are technically 2 players. The reason why it's important, I've heard this so many times when I've asked questions or seen responses to questions, is that it's so often on the card. Each mode must target a different player, right? So each of your opponents are a different player. But the reason why it doesn't say target player is because you cannot choose your teammate. You cannot choose yourself. You must target an opponent. And I don't know if each mode must target a different opponent, if that's verbiage that's been used on a Magic card. But I think that's where sort of maybe the confusion came in, is because you're looking at this sort of player as the team, whereby the Magic cards are looking at a player as a human being that's sitting there at the table with cards in their hand and, lands in front of them and so on and so forth. But yeah, I can definitely see where there's some confusion there from a Two-Headed Giant. But I think that's why the card is printed like that, right? It's just meant to differentiate between the fact that you can't target your friendly player, you can't target your partner, you must target an opponent, and you must target a different opponent with each ability.
Yeah, and I think that's what the ruling came down to. That was really where our confusion came from. And we got it wrong, but that's okay. It does, I think this card it was confusing, and it did bog down a game for about 5 to 10 minutes. So we were trying to figure out exactly what was what. Eventually, we went with what our ruling was, and then Anthony we got it.
Yeah, we worked it out because it was designed for an EDH world, right? Like it was for an internal world. And I thought this card was interesting because it had so many modal effects. But at the end of the day, when a card starts inhibiting gameplay, it detracts from what the card was trying to do anyways. I mean, right, wrong, or indifferent, if I'm playing a card that created that much catastrophe, that much chaos and confusion during a game, it didn't feel natural to the gameplay. And I just said, get it out of here, right? I mean, that happens sometimes with old wording of Magic cards. That happens with some of just the complexities. We're designing stuff for an EDH type environment, and then we introduce them into a 1v1, or in this case, a Two-Headed Giant environment. It changes the stakes of the card. We've seen this with other cards where maybe it's semi-mediocre but interesting, like Fractured Identity would be a good example there, Chris, where it was designed for an EDH world, but then when you pull it in a 1v1 environment, it becomes like this uber powerful, nonsensical card, and players look at that. That's what a lot of times when these commander sets come out, that's why probably they're intentionally overlooked by cube curators, is because the verbiage is a little different because it was designed for a multiplayer aspect. I saw that as a curator. I latched onto it. I thought I could harness it, but at the end of the day, when it starts detracting from gameplay, I just don't think it's worth it. And the ruling, we looked it up, and then I confirmed it with Lucky Looter, but it was whenever there is a team of 2 players and a spell or ability says it affects each player or opponent, it means that they are both affected individually. The only real difference between player and opponent is the player can apply to your teammates, where opponent just refers to your opponents. And then Lucky Looter, I fired this off to him. Thank you, Lucky. I appreciate your help. I like the ruling you've highlighted, and I see nothing inaccurate. Baylor can use 2 of its 3 modes. I think he later redacted that because he also equally confused Lucky Looter, who's a judge. That's enough for me as a curator to say, get it out of here, right? And then, Chris, would you mind taking on the next card that kind of became the same? It fell into the same dynamic, whether or not we liked it or not. I had an intention. We were playing it right, but I said, enough's enough.
Well, hang on, real quick. Now you've got Baylor, we've read the card and we understand what it does. You're putting it back in, right? Because Baylor's freaking awesome. So you're definitely putting it back in your 2-headed giant cube. Because I'll be sad if you take this out because...
you're going to have to be sad because I'm going to talk about this in a future episode. I replaced it with a Cascade environment that I added in there. After talking about Live the Dream with David McDarby, I just said, you know what? I want Cascade in my 2-headed giant cube. I think it's fun. I want to have my own version of Live the Dream. Thank you, David. But another card that fell victim to this too during this event was Sulfuric Vortex. And it's been around forever. Chris, would you mind reading this card, please?
Yeah, it's an oldie but a goodie. It's Sulfuric Vortex, 1 and 2 red. An enchantment. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, Sulfuric Vortex deals 2 damage to that player. If the player would gain life, that player gains no life instead. It's very simple. Usually, in a 1v1 especially, it's very simple. But it did give us some headaches. We were playing it correctly for the most part, but I understand why he wanted to cut it. It just slows the gameplay for discussion. I totally understand that.
It was just because there was different players, and that's what's really interesting about this event that we went to, the Gathering, right, where we got to see players come in, step in, and try something they've never tried before. And at the end of the day, Sulfuric Vortex actually does 4 damage to the team, but because of Baylord's verbiage, it wasn't too much long after that Sulfuric Vortex showed up, and they're like, you just told us this, it must be that. And then I just made an executive decision. He said, you know what, it's just too confusing. It slowed down gameplay, and frankly, me as a curator, I don't want that to happen, right? And,
right.
Rip both those cards. And I went home and I said, you know what? I'm going to come up with a solution. I had a Cascade, and here we are. Another card that kind of came across during the event that I watched, I have had this in my cube forever. Because as I told you guys in previous episodes, that I like squirrels, I like aristocrats, I like the janky nonsense, and I wanted this 2-headed giant cube to kind of embrace that silliness, right? And it was Clackbridge Troll. This card made me laugh. For 3 colorless and 2 swamps, you get a creature troll, 8/8, trample haste. When Clackbridge Troll entered the battlefield, target opponent creates 3/0/1 white goat tokens. At the beginning of combat on your turn, an opponent may sacrifice a creature. If a player does, tap Clackbridge Troll, you gain 3 life, and you draw a card.
The biggest problem I have with Clackbridge Troll, right, if you look at the art on this card, which is pretty awesome, but it's 2 white goats, or what looks like 2 white goats, and 1 brown goat. So where's this third white goat?
All right, Billy Goat's Gruff. Billy Goat's Gruff.
That we're talking
about.
Little
grim there for you.
So I'm going to assume, if you may, I'm going to assume that the confusion was it target opponent, as in the team creates 2 or 3 tokens, or was it each player, or was that where the confusion was?
No, it's 1 target opponent creates it. The reason I think he cut it was it just doesn't do anything. There's a whole squirrel package in there where they sacrifice any. It doesn't have to be a goat they sacrifice. It can be literally anything.
So it's
and
not
when you're running like a card,
goat.
like when you're running aristocrat style cards, it actually is a detriment in some respects. So you get it doesn't do anything.
I was giving my opponents a payoff, and that was what was interesting. Some of these cards that I ran for the silliness factor, and then I put them in front of these players, like we said, had walked over from legacy vintage cube environments to play a draft environment they've never done before, created this whole new, I guess, gameplay aesthetic, if you will, right? They had a different vibe, and their feedback was a lot more critical, but it was positive. They always gave me a solution, but it was they weren't playing it for the same, I guess, the same outcome that I was playing it when I'm sitting around with Stu and Chris and having a few drinks on a Friday night, right? It was a different vibe. So it was positive to me as a player. I don't want any of my cubes to ever become like these super laser fire, just I want to play the best of the best, right? Spiky nonsense. But at the same time, the critical feedback that we're going to call them for all intents and purposes, players either better than me or professional players, when they sat down at the table, their feedback mattered, right? It had a lot of weight to it. And they had reasons for telling me that these cards just didn't fit these three environments that I presented them during this event. Chris, do you have any thoughts on this before we kind of start coming to closing?
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think the cube will be better for it. There'll be less questions asked. And I think that's probably for the best. A lot of the other cards that target multiple opponents, it's pretty obvious what they're talking about and who they hit. There weren't any questions. Those are the only cards that really caused problems that I saw. And we drafted most of the cube, if I'm correct. I think we drafted almost all of it. And for the most part, those are the only ones that caused any issues. I think the cube's in a pretty good place, in my opinion. It's very fun. I really do enjoy it. Anyone at CubeCon this year, if you want to try it out, it's really fun. Highly recommend it.
Stu, do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, put Clackbridge Troll back in there, please.
And Baylor.
I want to play a cube with some goat tokens in it, and this was my only opportunity, and you've just ruined it for me, Anthony. Not happy. No, I agree. Like Chris said, it's got to do something, right? And I think 5 mana for an 8/8 trample haste might seem like it's great, but is it though? Like, I kind of want to be doing something a little bit more exciting for 5 mana. So, like, yeah, sure, you can impact the board and you maybe draw a card, but it's just a little bit uninspired. And especially in a 2-headed giant cube where, you know, you want more things that are going to be impactful negatively to both of your opponents or going to be positively impacting you and your teammates. So it's just, it's blah. It's incredibly medium as a card in general and just not the kind of vibe I'm looking for a 2-headed giant cube. So yeah, I agree 100%. Get it out of there.
Well, we just want to kind of say thank you for the Gathering Place for inviting us to this amazing event where we got to support Extra Life, Children's Miracle Network for Duke Hospital. And I want to say thank you to Chris, and I want to say thank you to Stu, as well as Nathan and Bill for showing up to help us get these cubes together. I want to thank all of the people who came together, specifically Kirby for his team coming out to give us feedback and just giving us critical, I guess, insight as to what I could do to make my cubes better. I want to thank Roland of Gan. I want to thank Harmless Fuzzball. And I want to say special thanks to Sam, one of our Patreons that came out, drove, and come to meet us. I'm looking forward to playing with you and real life here soon, Sam. Again, right? That was amazing. We're going to work on that soon. And then I want to thank Joshy4. All these are kind of just anonymous names, but you know who you are when I'm shouting you out. And I want to say thank you again to our Patreons. Once again, Sam and Preston for really supporting the show.
Yeah.
Both of you are just absolutely amazing human beings. And thank you so much. But this was a fun little kind of lighthearted episode.
I actually want to say, I've got to chip in at the end. I know we've said it about 50 times, but one last time, again, a huge thank you to Stephen Conafal for your prize support donation to this cause. It was a fantastic cause, a wonderful event, and you put a lot of smiles on people's faces, and they coughed up some cash to come and hang out with us and play these cubes. And yeah, Anthony got some good feedback and we had a good time, but obviously for the cause and for the children and for the Extra Life and the Children's Miracle Network, we're excited to hopefully do some more events for them in the future. And again, Stephen, for you and your donation of 2 boxes of Magic cards, which ain't pennies, that ain't cheap, we thank you very much. That was incredible, and we love you for it.
Also, which is really neat, is the Extra Life approached us and talked about us joining a team. So this is probably the first time I'm telling you guys this, but it was really neat, and we're really honored. And I'm going to reach out to them to see about doing a Team UberCube for Extra Life. And I want to say that we love the children here at UberCube, and we love everything about what this stands for. And we were able to raise, just among the drafters, and I want to say thank you to everybody, almost $500 in a very short amount of time, which was amazing. Goes to an amazing cause. So we're so honored and blessed to be a part of that. And we're looking forward to doing it again next year. And other than that, Stu, would you mind taking us to the socials, please?
Absolutely. So Please, first of all, if you want to get some bling on for your cube or whatever format you're playing, go take a look at Altasleeves. We have an affiliate link, altasleeves.com/UberCube. You can get 5% off your purchase. You can also use our Inked Gaming affiliate link. Go check out their products. They have playmats, dice bags, mouse pads, all kinds of custom and large volume products available. So if you need to get, a 720 cube or multiple 720 cube all blinged out, then go check them out. You can find us on Twitter at UberCubeMTGPod, or you can reach out to us via email, UberCubeMTGPodcast@gmail.com. And as always, come hang out with us on the Discord, #UberCube. Again, I'm going to put a shout out to my deck boast. We got a lot of cool conversations going, a lot of cool talk about cubes, about CubeCon as well, which is coming up very, very soon. A lot of activity been going on there recently, and we appreciate all of our listeners for coming and stopping by and hanging out. Anthony.
And now we're going to say the thing that we always do here at UberCube is Happy Cubing! Extra life.